The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome to the Provoke Media Podcast, in this episode in which we discuss why language matters in the intersection of business and politics. I'm Megan Keogan, host of today's episode, and joined by Global Strategy Group Partner and Managing Director Tanya Meck. Is it possible to talk about ESG values without running into the culture wars? How do I build and protect my brand in a divisive political environment? We'll unpack these and many more takeaways from the 10th edition of GSG's Business and Politics Report in today's episode. Tanya, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's great to chat again. Very excited to talk about a totally different topic than we did in our last episode together. But today we're here to talk about the Business and Politics Report. Tell us a little bit about your role at GSG, just for some quick background, and then maybe some background on this particular report.
Sure. So my role at GSG is to lead the communications and public affairs practice across the U.S., and then in conjunction with our global partner, Sec Newgate. And that role is client strategy and day-to-day work. It's running the business and growing the business. And it's some thought leadership, sort of how to bring what we know to our clients and beyond. And that's the Business and Politics Report that we're going to talk about a little bit today. And we've been doing this, for 10 years now. It's went by in a flash. When we were doing it, the concept of an intersection between business and politics, was new. But we've got data. We've got a decade worth of data, and so while we think everything that's happening today is new under the sun, that's not quite so. So we've got great perspective to bring to the conversation. I'm really excited to talk about some of the things that I'm sure all of your listeners are hearing and seeing in the news every day.
So first things first, is this where is the best place to access some of this data or report for any of our listeners who might want to kind of follow along with us today?
Sure. If you go to the GSG website, globalstrategygroup.com, you can go under the Insights tab. All our thought leadership will be there. And so it's probably easier if you do go there and follow along with some of the data. It's, as you and I were discussing, it's always challenging to talk about data without a whole bunch of graphs and charts to relate to, but we'll try to do that verbally today as well. And Megan, the other thing that I should say is when you asked about this report and you mentioned the conversation today will be different than the last one, right? Just to remind people, the last time we talked, we were talking about the creative side and sort of how our creative group, the lab, coordinates with the communications and public affairs work. Today, we're taking it to the other side of GSG, which is our research practice. And so this report really marries the communications experience with the research and polling experience that we have in-house at GSG. So it's going to be fun to talk about a different part of the business, but challenging without all the numbers.
Well, and I do encourage folks, we will link it on the Provoke Media website within the article alongside this. It is really digestible information. And I think that's from lay eyes, it's a pretty cool report to look at, especially as you were, as we were prepping for this call, Tanya, sharing just what a distinct and unique landscape we're living through right now in the scope of the ESG world, but the political realm and how that impacts business, which I suspect you can tell us a bit about how different this report felt to produce this year than perhaps in some years past.
Yeah, so in some ways it felt very similar, right? Because if you look at the report, you'll see, if you look at the question specifically, corporations have a responsibility to bring about social change on important issues facing society, right? Real straightforward question. We've been asking it since before 2017. And if you look over time, the answer, the percent of Americans who agree with that statement, corporations have a responsibility to bring about social change, has stayed pretty consistent. In 2017, it was 77%. 2022, it's 79%. It's fluctuated as high as 86, and it's never fallen under 77. And so consistently, that is the answer. Then each report teases out, a little bit of that. What does this mean? And this year, when we started looking at ESG, and particularly the attacks on woke companies or woke capitalism, and then the tie back to ESG, and we can talk a little bit about what ESG means. It was fascinating to us because the data shows some really distinct differences in language and how you talk about something that we didn't always see in the other reports. Those findings may have been a little bit more nuanced. This is a lot clearer. We also look directly at people's expectations of policymakers in this space. And for the first time, we see a real deep disconnect between American voters and some policymakers. And we can talk about, why we think that is.
Absolutely. Well, let's kick things off. Just quickly, background, who was polled for this and how did the survey come to life, or what's the procedure?
Sure. So we poll 1,000 Americans. We do this every year. We ask some trend questions and then try to add some new ones. But our pollsters help us write the questionnaire. We have statistically significant samples. We make sure that we've got enough Democrats and Republicans so that we can look at political differences. And then in conjunction with our communications team, pulls together this report. And it really is, the intersection. We've got some case studies in here that folks can take a look at, and then some hard data on how. What I like about it, Megan, is it's really, as you put it, you can navigate the data, and I think it shows some clear paths forward for our clients and others, and that's one of the things I'm most excited about.
One particularly interesting thing that jumped out at me, not just because it was towards the top of your report in the key findings, but throughout, is the insights around the term ESG and sort of how maybe perception has really changed, evolved, and differentiated from past years when this has been like such a big topic to discuss. And wondering if you can go into a little bit about what surprised you about the ESG findings. Was that something you were surprised by? How people perceive the term? Yes, you had lots of thoughts on it. So I'm curious to chat more on it.
Well, a lot of us who have been charged with communicating ESG over the past several years were surprised that 59% of Americans didn't know what the term was. I mean, surprised, not surprised, right? That's what happens when you're in your own little echo chamber. So Americans don't know what it means. We can frame it in a various number of ways, all accurate, and get wildly different reactions between different groups, and particularly because we're focused so much on the politics of this issue between Democrats and Republicans, right? So if you look at the data and you ask Democrats and Republicans if they approve of companies that speak out on social and political issues, right? You can see the net approval for Democrats is 50 and for Republicans it's -8, right? So a wild swing. If you talk about companies that have ESG initiatives, 82 net approval for Democrats, 34 for Republicans. So, 48-point difference. Again, people don't really know what ESG is, but some of them believe it to be a dirty word, right? So that's the swing there. When you move to companies that speak out on issues that are important to their employees and customers, the gap is only 16 points, right, between Democrats and Republicans. And then when you say companies that try to have a positive impact on their communities, which is essentially at the core of ESG, the gap is 5 points, right? 87% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans net approve of that statement. So it was so interesting to us to see, that the term ESG has become weaponized by a small group of ultra conservatives who are spending a lot of talk show airtime, a lot of ink time on that topic, and it doesn't resonate with most of the voters. But their base and part of their base believe it to be a dirty word, and because it's not defined, they've defined it. It is defined, but because it's not defined in the public consciousness, they've defined it for them.
Obviously, audience comes into a very big play, right? Knowing one's audience. Um, where would a business begin to assess if they actually know their audience, or they think they know from like the bubble, or to your word just a little bit ago, the echo chamber that they're in? I would imagine that the topic and the risk factors of various topics span based upon who your audience is, and is there any sort of guidance or process or recommendation on how to navigate those risk factors by topic?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, let's start with the audience question sort of writ large, right? You think about some of your key audiences, your employees. A lot of our clients have employee surveys, they have employee groups, there's internal communications. And so there is usually, although employee bases can be very diverse as well, there's usually some type of corporate consensus. Ladder up to your corporate values, right? They often use corporate values, vision, mission, and values sort of as a filter for what they will participate in, weigh in on, et cetera. So employees are a really important group. When you talk about external audiences, the data that we've seen when you look at consumers of goods and professional services writ large, there's still not a lot of reputational risk, because remember what we said when we set this up. A lot of Americans don't know, and a lot of Americans don't care. They think companies should do good, but it often stops there, right? When we looked at consumer purchasing behavior, so we looked at, are you more inclined to purchase if a company is a good corporate citizen? Are you less inclined to purchase because you think ESG is a dirty word, right? The boycotts and the boycotts, so to speak. We saw some movement, but not a lot. So not a lot of risk with your customer base, generally speaking. And again, this is across all types of companies, all types of customer bases. Place we found the most risk is the political risk, what I just said, right? Being tweeted about, called before Congress, sort of exposed for your ESG practices. And so, but you got to look at your customers, your clients, your investors, and you've got to understand what their view of ESG is. You have to understand what their appetite is, and then you got to weigh those different risk factors in making a decision. And then you asked Megan about issues, right? Like that's the thing.
Yep.
Clients will come to us and say, I don't want a red issue and I don't want a blue issue. I'd like a purple issue, right? There's not a whole lot of purple issues to go around in 2023 in the United States of America. Again, though, that has a lot to do with framing, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's a different response to protecting the environment than there is to eradicating climate change, right? Just as one, not shockingly, is more polarizing than the other, right? Just because of the way we've sort of drawn lines by language, right, in this country. But if you look at issues, ranging from, looking at some of the charts here, from equal access and opportunities for people with disabilities to cybersecurity, to women's equality in the workplace, all not particularly polarizing issues, right, for companies to weigh in on. And then when you get to things like gun safety, criminal justice reform, women's rights to choose, and LGBTQ plus equality, becomes highly polarized. So it's really reflecting, what we're seeing, in the broader universe. It doesn't mean that, our clients won't weigh in on some of the more polarizing issues, because they often do. But it just means they've got to be planful about it and explain the motivation to their most important stakeholder audiences.
And just context for our listeners right now, if you happen to pull this up, I believe it's on page 6, what Tanya's mentioning, but it's a very cool infographic, sort of a thermostat style, if you will, just sort of gauging the various degrees of risk for various topics. So we have
Well, I would say, Megan, sorry to interrupt you. It's degree of polarization, which I would normally say is a degree of risk too, but not really, because it all depends, to your question at the beginning, on knowing your audience, right? Yeah. So I've lost track of time, 2 business and politics reports ago, something like that, we were testing Nike's ads with Colin Kaepernick, right? And not everybody, the conventional wisdom was that was so risky. He was a polarizing figure. their sales would plummet. And it turned out, although it was a polarizing issue, their base loved it, right? The people who are already buying Nikes bought more Nikes. The
Yeah.
people who hated Nike for this ad were buying Nikes to burn them, were not Nike customers to begin with. And so it can be polarizing and not risky if you know your audience. So I just want to make that distinction. The chart is fascinating from a polarization viewpoint. So you can see how you talk about issues and sort of what that split is between both sides of the political spectrum.
And in sort of your research and your studying of this, have you determined the sweet spot of like how many issues should a company attempt to take on? Do you need to have a stance, whether it's more vocalized or less, on everything? Or is it better to care a lot about a few things and be very vocal about those? Is there guidance or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we always say to go back to your core values and make the decision, your core corporate values, and make the decision from there. Obviously, some can speak to and respond to a wider number, but eventually you dilute it, right? And so we say pick what's most important. There was a time, even a few years ago, that our clients were weighing in on every current event that was happening, national tragedy, and the sad fact is there's too many, right? And so their employees, their stakeholders were getting communication fatigue because it was one CEO statement or corporate statement after another. And so we're really encouraging our clients to take a look at, the top priorities for them. Are there things that directly relate to their business, their communities, their employees? And then doing for want of a better description, coming up with some sort of filter, right? There's no end to the things that you can address, talk about, create programs and initiatives for. And everybody's going to be asking you to, every affinity group, everybody's going to be asking you to weigh in somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Create that decision-making matrix so that you can sort of run that through those questions and then say, yeah, this is something that's really important, that it would be an obvious omission if we did not weigh in or if we did not do something here.
Yeah.
And not everything's going to make it through that. And not everything should make it through that filter.
Right. Do you have any examples? I know we've kind of mentioned like Disney in the deck about like case studies or some sort of anecdotal elements about ways that these risk factors have sort of presented themselves, or the polarization. I'm sorry, not to use risk again. The polarization has kind of become an issue or a factor of consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll start with Disney because it's a pretty robust case study, and there's data because conveniently we've been tracking Disney's reputation sometime between 2017 and now as well, right? We track a lot of the big brands over time in this report. And so what was really interesting to me as you watch sort of this standoff first between Disney and their employees, right, over the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and the pressure they were receiving from their internal stakeholders, then to take a stance, then to go to war with the governor of Florida, which played out on a national stage fairly spectacularly. When you look at what that did to their reputation, overall, and since 2017, we're looking at something like only a 4% drop. And that's primarily with Republicans, but that's not even a big drop, right? So from a reputational perspective, we haven't been seeing a whole lot of negative results. Likewise, on consumer behavior. I don't know, I'm not privy to their balance sheets, but they're a publicly traded company, and you look at them and you can see, that how they're doing. And so we'll see what happens over time. Politically, they, huge risk, right? They received a lot of pushback. They lost control of their local governance board. But as we continue, it unfolds, right? As you continue to read the news, turns out they anticipated that and got all their permitting approvals they need for the foreseeable future. And so, to be determined. But if that's one of the most visible and vicious fights that we've seen so far, the results right now say they're going to be okay, or more than
Yeah.
okay. I think the other way that we see it play out with our clients is for those that have significant operations in different states across the country, right? Red states and
Yeah.
blue states. And many of those have an employee base. Let's say they've got a more progressive employee base. So they're receiving, again, similar to Disney, incredible internal pressure to weigh in on a whole host of traditionally democratic issues.
Yeah.
And they've got a leadership team that's saying, okay, that's great. And that might play well on the East Coast or the West Coast. But how's that going to play, not just with the governments in some of our other states, but with some of our employees there too? And that's the part that we've really had to help clients navigate sort of those different stakeholder audiences.
How about when we've maybe seen a downward trend in reputation because of some unfortunate missteps or speaking out maybe too vocally on a subject?
Mm-hmm.
What is sort of the protocol or rule of thumb for starting to climb your way back? Is it to swing the pendulum the other way, stay quiet for a bit? How do you determine what the next steps look like?
Yeah, it's obviously specific to the client and in the particular issue and whatever that misstep was. But I would say, as a general rule, we often advise them not to swing the pendulum the other way really quickly, right? It's almost like we think about it when you make a mistake and you have to sort of go on a listening and apology tour, right? That's often your first step, right? You admit you made a mistake. You listen to the folks that are the aggrieved parties. You ask them what they would have done differently. You hear them out. And then you're thoughtful about what you're going to do next. You take the time to step back and really analyze the situation and get away from some of the immediate emotion. And then you can decide what you do. And the most important thing in that instance is only say things that you know are doable, that you commit to doing, and that you're going to report on, right? As it goes.
Yeah.
You see people making big promises, and then a year goes by, 2 years go by, and then somebody invariably asks what you've done, right? And so it's better to report on your progress along the way. Nobody expects companies and leaders to be perfect, but they do expect to see progress and have some type of transparency in those conversations. So again, it's more of the process. Than a definitive, you need to do this, and this is, how fast you should move.
Absolutely. And I guess that sort of sets up the question of, we all came out of 2020 feeling like every company had a new initiative for DE&I and for, workplace wellness and everything. And there was, for a hot minute there in 2021, I think, and maybe even a little 22, like a reflection on what did we do? Did we hold ourselves accountable? What learnings, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot because this isn't identified in the deck, but are there takeaways that we can infer from sort of this universal experience that everybody walked through in 2021 and 2020, and how people have maintained or not maintained their
Well, Megan, you're talking about sort of the COVID sort of workplace disruption and coming back and taking care of our employees and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting question, and right, no data. So now we're having a conversation that my counterparts in research would say is founded in nothing, but my opinion, but also my experience, right, and working with our clients. There was a lot of assumptions made about what employees wanted and needed, and where there were some conversations, but I don't think enough. And so we moved fast and furiously to create all of these programs and structures, and not everybody took the time to let things settle a little bit and then ask the questions. What do you really need? Or we set up programs that just didn't really have a great effect, but now it's hard to get to get rid of them, right? So because you get used to it. So I think it's the same thing from work from home, hybrid work. Now we're having conversations, and we do a lot of internal communication. So we're having a lot of conversations on behalf of our clients What do your employees actually want and need? How do they work best? And it's a little bit more of a gradual and thoughtful approach, right? We didn't see everybody saying, okay, it's over now. Everybody's some industries send everybody back, wholesale. But it seems now we're having a much more thoughtful conversation, and we're also understanding that our audiences are nuanced here too, right? So our employee bases are not homogenous, and we might have to come up with some different solutions for different groups of people. And so I think that was a great case study of not throwing everything into, in the kitchen sink to address a problem right away.
Absolutely.
But I will say what I can say from research, we did a ton of research in COVID communications and in employee engagement. Companies experience some of their highest favorability from their internal audiences during COVID, primarily because of the way they reacted to and during the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. And the supports that they provided. So I don't want to discount what those efforts meant, and that maybe they weren't, the right ones or the most effective or for the long term, but they bought a huge amount of goodwill with employees.
Absolutely. And I guess one other question I had that was sort of more likening or like comparing 2020, 2021 to today. There was a lot of pressure on brands to react really fast. Yeah. And if you were at a company that wasn't reacting very fast, you were suddenly questioning, what does your company stand for, if nothing? Yes. Which is counter to any thoughtful decision. It seems like there was a price to pay by not taking a stance.
There was,
quickly, as much as there was to taking too hasty of a stance. What happens when, as a world, hopefully we don't all walk through this at the same time together again, but when there is an issue that requires a faster response, or it seems like your consumer base is expecting something of you more immediately, what are some of the better ways to be prepared to know what you might do or you might respond with?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that question, because it's so interesting, right? There used to be a time before it was an expectation to respond in real time where first movers actually had a reputational benefit, right? The data shows there was a controversy, a national tragedy, some companies spoke out, huge reputational bump, right? The companies that never weighed in, deficit, right? So to your point there, you were punished for not weighing in. Then the world got fast and furious, and these events were happening every day. And we talked about that sort of engagement overload where you were expected to weigh in, all the time. And by the way, it was within the first couple hours, not even the first 24 hours, right? We tested, should you weigh in immediately? We live in a real time society with all those expectations. And so it became, clearly untenable and probably ill-advised, to be honest. So, but there is, and hopefully it is not on the scale of what we just experienced, but where it's obvious that something needs to happen. That's a conversation that companies should be having right now, right? They should have the conversation of, when will we move quickly? It's a scenario plan, right? It's like the crisis scenario planning, that we do for our clients, not from an operational perspective, but from an engagement and a communications perspective. These are the types of issues where we need to respond within X number of hours, X number of days. Okay, well, what will guide that? Who will guide that? What does the operational structure look like? Should we start talking about, what platforms we'll use to communicate? How will we do that, et cetera? And so it's incredibly empowering when you can have those conversations in a lower stress environment where you can go back and forth a million times and tweaking the statement or the email, and then you can run it by legal, and then you can focus group it, and you can have it ready, as opposed to, by focus group, I mean with your important stakeholders. And then you're ready, and you might need to tweak it when it's go time, but you're not starting from scratch. And so, and you also know if it's something that's not important for you to weigh in, or, if there's no choice.
That matrix that you mentioned a few minutes ago really comes into play in sort of setting you up for, as you had mentioned, I think in our prep conversation, pre-gaming, like coming up with your pre-game strategy, right? And there is something so useful about a matrix to just say, almost rank it in urgency, or like the prioritization of how fast should a response be.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's just listen, there's just as we've said over and over again today, there's so much that companies and leaders are called on to address and engage with, that without that structure, that in itself is a full-time job, trying to make those decisions. So putting a little structure and discipline around that, while staying true to your organizational values, principles, and stakeholders is incredibly helpful. I mean, I can't speak enough to what we've seen on both sides of that, right? How you react when you have a plan and structure like that, and how you're forced to react and respond when you don't.
Yeah. And when we talk about like stakeholders or the focus group, how much importance or credence do you think should be given to? Should a lot of people have eyes on something right before it goes out? Should it go to your company to see if your employer base has gross objection? Have you already decided to take that risk at that point? I know these are kind of like scenario based things, but
Yeah.
for businesses who are wondering, how far do I step out? How loud do I yell out? What is sort of the rule of thumb?
Yeah, the closer you get, the fewer people who should be editing or having eyes on it, right? I mean, we've all had the experience with our clients and folks who are in-house, where you're trying to get something out the door and you're editing it with 10 people, and that's just never going to go, right?
Yeah.
It's not happening. So decide who needs to weigh in, if there's proxies for certain groups or people. Have it ready to go, and ultimately it should be a really small and tight group that makes any final edits or changes. And then because you should have pre-gamed your risk ahead of time, right? It's not the time to do that during whatever the situation is.
Absolutely. And to circle back to some of the earlier things that we were opening with, which was language matters and the framing of things matter. Can you talk us through a little bit about, we talked about the difference between, like, I think it was maybe global warming versus environmental as a broadly friendlier type or approachable type bucket. But what are some of the other ways, that the framing can really work to a brand's advantage as they're trying to navigate?
Yeah, framing it with respect to your stakeholders, right? This is important for my employees because this is important for my community because it can even be this is important for our bottom line. I mean, right? Like ESG was born out of an investment strategy that assumes that it is a better investment strategy because it's looking at long-term risks, right? So you can even frame it as it's good for my bottom line. But when you think about your different stakeholder groups, think about framing why it is important to them. And if you explain your motivation, everything that we have seen in the data and everything that we've experienced with our clients, that even if people don't agree, in fact, we even tested, even if it is politically controversial, right?
Yeah.
And it is still, a vast majority find that to be acceptable, right? And favorable for a company to do that. So it's really about bringing it home and explaining the why. And you've got great latitude to weigh in on even politically controversial issues.
Absolutely. You have given us so much to think about today. You've given us some great resources and tools online that I hope our listeners will also go check out. This has been a really fascinating conversation, which could go on for a long time. And hopefully there will be an 11th edition, and maybe we'll get to chat on that one too, to talk about the differences.
I would love to do that.
Absolutely. Any parting thoughts, things that we have overlooked? I know we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, I think maybe just remind communicators that while there's a disconnect by what we're hearing from some policymakers and the coverage in the media and what the American public actually wants and is interested in. And in fact, if you poll them and ask them what they care about, you will hear things like inflation and jobs and healthcare and crime and Social Security and Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. And way, way, way at the bottom of the list will be investigating how U.S. companies spend money on ESG initiatives. So I hope that some of our clients can take comfort in that and heart in that. And again, it doesn't mean it's without risk, but I really am glad that you gave us the opportunity to put some of that in perspective today.
Thank you, Tanya Meck and Global Strategy Group, GSG, for joining us. This has been the Provoke Media Podcast.
You've been listening to the Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.